Section 12 of Beacon Lights of History, Volume 1, The Old Pagan Civilizations. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by K. Hand. Beacon Lights of History, Volume 1, The Old Pagan Civilizations, by John Lord. Socrates, Part 1. 470 to 399 B.C. Greek Philosophy. To Socrates the world owes a new method in philosophy and a great example in morals, and it would be difficult to settle whether his influence has been greater as a sage or a moralist. In either light he is one of the august names of history. He has been venerated for more than 2000 years as a teacher of wisdom, and as a martyr for the truths he taught. He did not commit his precious thoughts to writing; that work was done by his disciples, even as his exalted worth has been published by them, especially by Plato and Xenophon. And if the Greek philosophy did not culminate in him, yet he laid down those principles by which only it could be advanced. As a system maker, both Plato and Aristotle were greater than he, yet for original genius he was probably their superior, and in important respects he was their master. As a good man, battling with infirmities and temptations, and coming off triumphantly, the ancient world has furnished no prouder example. He was born about 470 or 469 years B.C., and therefore may be said to belong to that brilliant age of Grecian literature and art when Prodicus was teaching rhetoric, and Democritus was speculating about the doctrine of atoms, and Phidias was ornamenting temples, and Alcibiades was giving banquets, and Aristophanes was writing comedies, and Euripides was composing tragedies, and Aspasia was setting fashions, and Cimon was fighting battles, and Pericles was making Athens the centre of Grecian civilization. But he died 30 years after Pericles, so that what is most interesting in his great career took place during and after the Peloponnesian War, an age still interesting, but not so brilliant as the one which immediately preceded it. It was the age of the Sophists, those popular but superficial teachers who claimed to be the most advanced of their generation, men who were doubtless accomplished, but were cynical, skeptical, and utilitarian, placing a high estimate on popular favor and outside life, but very little on pure subjective truth or the wants of the soul. They were paid teachers, and sought pupils from the sons of the rich, the more eminent of them being Protagoras, Gorgias, Hippias, and Prodicus, men who travelled from city to city, exciting great admiration for their rhetorical skill, and really improving the public speaking of popular orators. They also taught science to a limited extent, and it was through them that Athenian youth mainly acquired what little knowledge they had of arithmetic and geometry. In loftiness of character they were not equal to those Ionian philosophers who, prior to Socrates in the 5th century B.C., speculated on the great problems of the material universe, the origin of the world, the nature of matter, and the source of power, and who, if they did not make discoveries, yet evinced great intellectual force. It was in this skeptical and irreligious age, when all classes were devoted to pleasure and money making, but when there was great cultivation, especially in arts, that Socrates arose, whose appearance, says Grote, was a moral phenomenon. He was the son of a poor sculptor, and his mother was a midwife. His family was unimportant, although it belonged to an ancient Attic gens. Socrates was rescued from his father's workshop by a wealthy citizen who perceived his genius, and who educated him at his own expense. He was 20 when he conversed with Parmenides and Zeno. He was 28 when Phidias adorned the Parthenon. He was 40 when he fought at Potidaea and rescued Alcibiades. At this period he was most distinguished for his physical strength and endurance, a brave and patriotic soldier, insensible to heat and cold, and, though temperate in his habits, capable of drinking more wine without becoming intoxicated than anybody in Athens. His powerful physique and sensual nature inclined him to self-indulgence, but he early learned to restrain both appetites and passions. His physiognomy was ugly, and his person repulsive. He was awkward, obese, and ungainly. His nose was flat, his lips were thick, and his neck large. He rolled his eyes, went barefooted, and wore a dirty old cloak. He spent his time chiefly in the market-place, talking with everybody, old or young, rich or poor, soldiers, politicians, artisans, or students, visiting even Aspasia, the cultivated, wealthy courtesan, with whom he formed a friendship, so that, although he was very poor, his whole property being only 5 minae, about $50 a year, It would seem he lived in good society. The ancient pagans were not so exclusive and aristocratic as the Christians of our day, who are ambitious of social position. Socrates never seemed to think about his social position at all, and uniformly acted as if he were well known and prominent. He was listened to because he was eloquent. His conversation is said to have been charming, and even fascinating. He was an original and ingenious man, different from everybody else, and was therefore what we call a character. But there was nothing austere or gloomy about him. Though lofty in his inquiries and serious in his mind, he resembled neither a Jewish prophet nor a mediaeval sage in his appearance. He looked rather like a Silenus, very witty, cheerful, good natured, jocose, and disposed to make people laugh. He enjoined no austerities or penances. He was very attractive to the young, and tolerant of human infirmities, even when he gave the best advice. He was the most human of teachers. Alcibiades was completely fascinated by his talk, and made good resolutions. His great peculiarity in conversation was to ask questions, sometimes to gain information, but oftener to puzzle and raise a laugh. He sought to expose ignorance when it was pretentious. He made all the quacks and shams appear ridiculous. His irony was tremendous. Nobody could stand before his searching and unexpected questions, and he made nearly every one with whom he conversed appear either as a fool or an ignoramus. He asked his questions with great apparent modesty, and thus drew a mesh over his opponents from which they could not extricate themselves. His process was the reductio ad absurdum. Hence he drew upon himself the wrath of the Sophists. He had no intellectual arrogance, since he professed to know nothing himself, although he was conscious of his own intellectual superiority. He was contented to show that others knew no more than he. He had no passion for admiration, no political ambition, no desire for social distinction, and he associated with men not for what they could do for him, but for what he could do for them. Although poor, he charged nothing for his teachings. He seemed to despise riches, since riches could only adorn or pamper the body. He did not live in a cell or a cave or a tub, but among the people as an apostle. He must have accepted gifts, since his means of living were exceedingly small, even for Athens. He was very practical, even while he lived above the world, absorbed in lofty contemplations. He was always talking with such as the skin dressers and leather dealers, using homely language for his illustrations, and uttering plain truths. Yet he was equally at home with poets and philosophers and statesmen. He did not take much interest in that knowledge which was applied merely to rising in the world. Though plain, practical, and even homely in his conversation, he was not utilitarian. Science had no charm to him, since it was directed to utilitarian ends and was uncertain. His sayings had such a lofty hidden wisdom that very few people understood him. His utterances seemed either paradoxical, or unintelligible, or sophistical. To the mentally proud and mentally feeble he was equally a bore. Most people probably thought him a nuisance, since he was always about with his questions, puzzling some, confusing others, and reproving all, careless of love or hatred, and contemptuous of all conventionalities. So severely dialectical was he that he seemed to be a hair splitter. The very Sophists, whose ignorance and pretension he exposed, looked upon him as a quibbler, although there were some, so severely trained was the Grecian mind, who saw the drift of his questions and admired his skill. Probably there are few educated people in these times who could have understood him any more easily than a modern audience, even of scholars, could take in one of the orations of Demosthenes, although they might laugh at the jokes of the sage and be impressed with the invectives of the orator. And yet there were defects in Socrates. He was most provokingly sarcastic. He turned everything to ridicule. He remorselessly punctured every gas bag he met. He heaped contempt on every snob. He threw stones at every glass house, and everybody lived in one. He was not quite just to the Sophists, for they did not pretend to teach the higher life, but chiefly rhetoric, which is useful in its way. And if they loved applause and riches, and attached themselves to those whom they could utilize, they were not different from the most fashionable teachers in any age. And then Socrates was not very delicate in his tastes. He was too much carried away by the fascinations of Aspasia, when he knew she was not virtuous, although it was doubtless her remarkable intellect which most attracted him, not her physical beauty, since in the Menexenus, by many ascribed to Plato, he is made to recite at length one of her long orations, and in the Symposium he is made to appear absolutely indelicate in his conduct with Alcibiades, and to make what would be abhorrent to us a matter of irony, although there was the severest control of the passions. To me it has always seemed a strange thing that such an ugly, satirical, provoking man could have won and retained the love of Xanthippe, especially since he was so careless of his dress, and did so little to provide for the wants of the household. I do not wonder that she scolded him, or became very violent in her temper, since in her worst tirades he only provokingly laughed at her. A modern Christian of society would have left him; but perhaps in pagan Athens she could not have got a divorce. It is only in these enlightened and progressive times that women desert their husbands when they are tantalizing, or when they do not properly support the family, or spend their times at the clubs or in society, into which it would seem that Socrates was received, even the best, barefooted and dirty as he was, and for his intellectual gifts alone. Think of such a man being the oracle of a modern salon, either in Paris, London, or New York, with his repulsive appearance and tantalizing and provoking irony. But in artistic Athens, at one time, he was all the fashion. Everybody liked to hear him talk. Everybody was both amused and instructed. He provoked no envy, since he affected modesty and ignorance, apparently asking his questions for information, and was so meanly clad and lived in such a poor way. Though he provoked animosities, he had many friends. If his language was sarcastic, his affections were kind. He was always surrounded by the most gifted men of his time. The wealthy Crito constantly attended him. Plato and Xenophon were enthusiastic pupils; even Alcibiades was charmed by his conversation. Apollodorus and Antisthenes rarely quitted his side. Cebes and Simonides came from Thebes to hear him. Socrates and Aristippus followed in his train. Euclid of Megara sought his society at the risk of his life. The tyrant Critias and even the sophist Protagoras acknowledged his marvellous power. But I cannot linger longer on the man, with his gifts and peculiarities. More important things demand our attention. I propose briefly to show his contributions to philosophy and ethics. In regard to the first, I will not dwell on his method, which is both subtle and dialectical. We are not Greeks. Yet it was his method which revolutionized philosophy. That was original. He saw this, that the theories of his day were mere opinions, even the lofty speculations of the Ionian philosophers were dreams, and the teachings of the Sophists were mere words. He despised both dreams and words. Speculations ended in the indefinite and insoluble; words ended in rhetoric. Neither dreams nor words revealed the true, the beautiful, and the good, which to his mind were the only realities, the only sure foundation for a philosophical system. So he propounded certain questions, which, when answered, produced glaring contradictions, from which disputants shrank. Their conclusions broke down their assumptions; they stood convicted of ignorance, to which all his artful and subtle questions tended, and which it was his aim to prove. He showed that they did not know what they affirmed. He proved that their definitions were wrong or incomplete, since they logically led to contradictions; and he showed that for purposes of disputation the same meaning must always attach to the same word, since in ordinary language terms have different meanings, partly true and partly false, which produce confusion in argument. He would be precise and definite, and use the utmost rigor of language, without which inquirers and disputants would not understand each other. Every definition should include the whole thing and nothing else, otherwise people would not know what they were talking about, and would be forced into absurdities. Thus arose the celebrated definitions, the first step in Greek philosophy, intending to show what is and what is not. After demonstrating what is not, Socrates advanced to the demonstration of what is, and thus laid a foundation for certain knowledge. Thus he arrived at clear conceptions of justice, friendship, patriotism, courage, and other certitudes on which truth is based. He wanted only positive truth, something to build upon, like Bacon and all great inquirers. Having reached the certain, he would apply it to all the relations of life and to all kinds of knowledge. Unless knowledge is certain, it is worthless; there is no foundation to build upon. Uncertain or indefinite knowledge is no knowledge at all; it may be very pretty, or assuming, or ingenious, but no more valuable for philosophical research than poetry or dreams or speculations. How far the definitions of Socrates led to the solution of the great problems of philosophy in the hands of such dialecticians as Plato and Aristotle I will not attempt to enter upon here; but this I think I am warranted in saying, that the main object and aim of Socrates, as a teacher of philosophy, were to establish certain elemental truths concerning which there could be no dispute, and then to reason from them, since they were not mere assumptions but certitudes, and certitudes also which appealed to human consciousness, and therefore could not be overthrown. If I were teaching metaphysics, it would be necessary for me to make clear this method. the questions and definitions by which Socrates is thought to have laid the foundation of true knowledge, and therefore of all healthful advance in philosophy. But for my present purpose I do not care so much what his method was as what his aim was. The aim of Socrates, then, being to find out and teach what is definite and certain, as a foundation of knowledge, having cleared away the rubbish of ignorance, he attached very little importance to what is called physical science. And no wonder, since science in his day was very imperfect. There were not enough facts known on which to base sound inductions, better, deductions from established principles. What is deemed most certain in this age was the most uncertain of all knowledge in his day. Scientific knowledge, truly speaking, there was none; it was all speculation. Democritus might resolve the material universe, the earth, the sun, and the stars, into combinations produced by the motion of atoms. But whence the original atoms, and what force gave to them motion? The proudest philosopher, speculating on the origin of the universe, is convicted of ignorance. Much has been said in praise of the Ionian philosophers, and justly, so far as their genius and loftiness of character are considered. But what did they discover? What truths did they arrive at to serve as foundation stones of science? They were among the greatest intellects of antiquity, but their method was a wrong one. Their philosophy was based on assumptions and speculations, and therefore was worthless, since they settled nothing. Their science was based on inductions which were not reliable because of a lack of facts. They drew conclusions as to the origin of the universe from material phenomena. Thales, seeing that plants are sustained by dew and rain, concluded that water was the first beginning of things. Anaximenes, seeing that animals die without air, thought that air was the great primal cause. Then Diogenes of Crete, making a fanciful speculation, imparted to air an intellectual energy. Heraclitus of Ephesus substituted fire for air. None of the illustrious Ionians reached anything higher than that the first cause of all things must be intelligent. The speculations of succeeding philosophers, living in a more material age, all pertained to the world of matter which they could see with their eyes. And in close connection with speculations about matter, the cause of which they could not settle, was indifference to the spiritual nature of man, which they could not see, and all the wants of the soul, and the existence of the future state, where the soul alone was of any account. So atheism, and the disbelief of the existence of the soul after death, characterized that materialism. Without God and without a future, there was no stimulus to virtue, and no foundation for anything. They said, "Let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we die," the essence and spirit of all paganism. Socrates, seeing how unsatisfactory were all physical inquiries, and what evils materialism introduced into society, making the body everything and the soul nothing, turned his attention to the world within, for physics substituted morals. He knew the uncertainty of physical speculation, but believed in the certainty of moral truths. He knew that there was a reality in justice, in friendship, in courage. Like Job, he reposed on consciousness. He turned his attention to what afterwards gave immortality to Descartes. To the skepticism of the sophists he opposed self-evident truths. He proclaimed the sovereignty of virtue, the universality of moral obligation. Moral certitude was the platform from which he would survey the universe. It was the ladder by which he would ascend to the loftiest regions of knowledge and of happiness. Though he was negative in his means, he was positive in his ends. He was the first who had glimpses of the true mission of philosophy, even to sit in judgment on all knowledge, whether it pertains to art or politics or science, eliminating the false and retaining the true. It was his mission to separate truth from error. He taught the world how to weigh evidence. He would discard any doctrine which, logically carried out, led to absurdity. Instead of turning his attention to outward phenomena, he dwelt on the truths which either God or consciousness reveals. Instead of the creation, he dwelt on the Creator. It was not the body he cared for so much as the soul. Not wealth, not power, not the appetites were the true source of pleasure, but the peace and harmony of the soul. The inquiry should be, not what we shall eat, but how we shall resist temptation. How shall we keep the soul pure? How shall we arrive at virtue? How shall we best serve our country? How shall we best educate our children? How shall we expel worldliness and deceit and lies? How shall we walk with God? For there is a God, and there is immortality and eternal justice. These are the great certitudes of human life, and it is only by these that the soul will expand and be happy forever. Section 12.